Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Schamberg, and the title of the research article I'll be presenting to you today is Boosting School Staff Wellbeing and Engagement Through Identity Leadership: The Mediating Role of Organizational Climate. This article was recently published in May 2024 in the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology. So, previous research has demonstrated that being part of a group is essential to well being and mental health. And with that, group based leadership in schools is gaining interest. This form of leadership focuses on leaders being a part of the group as opposed to being separate from the group and having a shared identity among staff, really emphasizing we and us versus I and me. Furthermore, emerging research has shown increased evidence that identity leadership is related to better well being and engagement among employees and organizations. Research has also demonstrated that well being and engagement among school staff, in particular, is associated with lower rates of burnout, lower stress, and higher self esteem among staff, which in turn leads to improved educational quality for students and better student outcomes. Additionally, previous research has shown that a positive school climate also leads to better well being and motivation among staff, along with higher job satisfaction and lower rates of burnout. And finally, the majority of existing research looking at the process of how group based leadership has impacted staff has mostly been cross sectional. So, with this in mind, the researchers of this study wanted to test how school identity leadership relates to staff well being and engagement and the role of climate as a mediator using a three-wave longitudinal model with wave one as the beginning of the study, wave two is 1 year later, and wave three is 2 years later. So there were two hypotheses tested in this study. First, the study tested whether identity leadership in wave one, which is the beginning of the study, would be associated with higher levels of well being and engagement in wave three, 2 years later. Second, it examined the mechanism by which this process occurred. So they wanted to test whether perceived identity leadership in wave one fostered a more positive school climate in wave two, and wave two is 1 year later. And then, if that in turn was associated with better staff well being and engagement in wave three, which is 2 years later. So, let's look at the participants of the study. The participants of this study were school staff members from 89 public schools in Australia who took part in annual surveys over 3 years: 2018, 2019, and 2020. A total of 6,373 individuals participated across at least one of the three waves of data collection, with about 3,600 participants responding each year. And the sample consisted of a mix of full time and part time male female staff, mostly full time, mostly female, with varying levels of teaching experience and age categories represented. And you can see the breakdown of the categories of age and teaching experience here on the screen. Okay, so this was a complex study. This diagram represents how the hypotheses were tested. So we'll kind of go through all of the sections of this diagram. On the left, you can see identity leadership, and that is the first wave. That was the first thing that was tested. Um, the big box in the center includes components of well being and engagement that were measured at wave three. And then on the top, you can see organizational climate is what was measured at wave two. And then on the far right, you can see that the researchers controlled for the initial level of organizational climate and the outcome variables, which again are well-being and engagement. And then those three rectangles kind of in the middle on the right, teaching experience, age, and gender, those were the three demographic variables that were used as covariates. So we'll talk about the results in just a moment, but just so you can kind of understand a little bit more about what this diagram is showing, it's really demonstrating those hypotheses that we just talked about. So it's showing that identity leadership at wave one is associated with higher levels of well-being and engagement at wave 3. And then it shows that second hypothesis that identity leadership at wave 1 leads to better climate at wave 2, which is 1 year later, which then impacts well-being and engagement at wave 3 or 2 years later. And organizational climate, that is the mediating factor. So we'll talk more about what that means, but it definitely took me quite a few times looking at this to kind of wrap my head around it. Okay, so now let's talk about the measurements that were used. The researchers used items from various surveys to collect all of the information on school staff well-being and engagement, along with organizational climate and identity leadership. The first survey here, this one explicitly measured identity leadership, and the second one listed on the screen explicitly measured school climate. And then the next 3 surveys were used to determine well-being, and the last 3 surveys listed were used to determine engagement. And there's an example item from each of those surveys listed underneath each of them, so you can take a look at that if you'd like. Okay. So getting into the methods used for analyzing the data, the analysis methods were pretty complex. So as I mentioned, the researchers used a 3-wave longitudinal survey to examine changes over time and how identity leadership influenced staff and climate. So the data analysis involved hierarchical multi-level modeling to analyze data at both the individual level, so looking at teachers, and the group level, which is schools, at the same time. And this is important because within a school system, or what we would call a school district, there are many schools. There are elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and each of those schools within that school district may have its own culture and climate. And also within that district, teachers belong to certain specific schools. So this method helps capture the idea that teachers within the same school might share similar experiences that are different from teachers in another school. And instead of ignoring these differences or treating everyone as entirely independent, hierarchical multi-level modeling takes into account how both individual factors, like a teacher's experience, and group factors, like the overall school climate, impact outcomes such as well-being or job satisfaction. So it's just really a better way to understand how factors at different levels work together to influence results. Some other methods used to analyze the data: null models were used to see how much of the variation in outcomes, like well-being, was due to individual characteristics specific to each staff member versus school-level factors. Additionally, they tested how identity leadership directly affected well-being and engagement over time. And finally, they examined whether identity leadership indirectly influenced these outcomes by improving the school climate first. There were a few statistical tools that were used to figure out which models best explain the data. They used statistical tools like AIC and log likelihood ratios. And full disclosure, I am not very familiar with either of those. To deal with any missing information, the researchers used a method called full information maximum likelihood, which allowed them to include as much available data as possible, giving them more accurate and reliable results. And then finally, they controlled for climate and outcomes and included 3 demographic variables as covariates in their analysis. By doing this, they tested the extent to which initial levels of identity leadership are associated with changes in those variables over time. So what were the results? Well, overall, both hypotheses were supported, highlighting the direct and indirect positive impacts of identity leadership on school outcomes. So for hypothesis 1, the results indicated that identity leadership at wave 1, which again is the beginning of the study, was associated with better well-being outcomes for school staff by wave 3, 2 years later. And specifically, staff who perceived their leaders as demonstrating identity leadership reported lower levels of burnout and stress, as well as slightly higher self-esteem. And this relationship was significant at both the individual level within each school and to some extent at the school level, so between schools. So these findings suggest that identity leadership had a positive impact on staff well-being over time. And for hypothesis 2, the results showed that identity leadership at wave 1 led to more positive school climate by wave 2, which is 1 year later, and that contributed to better well-being and higher engagement by wave 3, 2 years later. So, this means that identity leadership didn't just directly improve well being or engagement. Instead, it first created a more positive school climate, which then led to those improved outcomes. And these indirect effects suggest that identity leaders' influence on staff members' well being and engagement, it's partly because they contribute to a positive climate. So, there were a couple of strengths and limitations that we can discuss briefly. The authors described 4 strengths of their study. First, it was a theory driven approach. Second, it's one of the few multi year longitudinal investigations that examine long term relationships between identity leadership, organizational climate, staff well being, and engagement, specifically in a school context. Um, the use of hierarchical multi-level modeling was a major strength because it accounted for both individual level and school level differences, which really provided a more comprehensive understanding of how leadership impacts outcomes at different levels within an organization, or in this case, in a school system. And finally, it was a really large sample size with over 6,000 participants across multiple waves. The study really had a large and diverse sample. Of course, there's always some limitations to any study, and the authors acknowledge this. Um, they acknowledge that there were some participants that dropped off or changed schools during the study period, and those data sets were excluded. And the authors acknowledge that a smaller amount of missing data would have been ideal. And also, the study relied on self reported data from participants, so those subjective surveys. And that can introduce biases such as social desirability, where participants might respond in a way that they think is expected, or also there might be recall bias. And so this can affect the accuracy of the data that is collected. So, when we look at implications for future research, there are several directions where this could go. So, first, future studies could focus on how new staff experience well being and engagement when joining schools. So, if it's a longitudinal study, when someone comes into a school 1 or 2 years in, how does that experience impact their well being and engagement? Additionally, it might be valuable to explore the extent of agreement among staff within the same school regarding the strength of identity leadership and how this shared perception affects well-being and engagement. Personally, I think that it would be worthwhile to look at how other leadership styles like transformational leadership, shared leadership, even passive leadership impact well-being, engagement, and climate in schools. And finally, regarding the practical application of the findings, I think that the next logical step is looking at providing identity leadership trainings for leaders in schools with an emphasis on equipping them with the skills to effectively build a cohesive group identity and foster a supportive school climate that really enhances staff well-being and engagement over time. So thank you so much for listening. That's all I have. Thank you so much.